All right, welcome. Today I'm sitting with Sandra Chow, the Director of Innovation and Digital Learning at Keystone Academy in Beijing, China. And we're continuing a series talking about schools that have been learning through and thriving through their pivot to online learning. Sandra, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to
Uh,
chat.
Yeah, it's nice to talk. Sandra and I met at the the first international cohort of ISTE certified educators at Western Academy, at the International School of Beijing back in May 2019. She's been doing a lot of great work at Keystone, and Keystone's been doing a lot of great work through this whole through the whole pandemic. So I wanted to take this chance to sit down and talk with her and see what Sandra and Keystone can share that might help us reimagine schooling to create the types of schools that our children both need and deserve for the future. So Sandra, do you want to go ahead and maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself and about Keystone Academy?
Sure. So I joined Keystone Academy 2 years ago, and there was a new position here. At that time, it was called the Director of Educational Technology, and our school was in its 5th year of operation, and so we're still a pretty new school, but it grew really large. Our school is a bilingual private school that's a not-for-profit organization. Most of our student population come from China and live in China, but the purpose for having our school was to have an education that was a little bit different from what the public school was offering. It was one that would have a more global and world mindset and perspective, and offered an opportunity for a more international education, while at the same time still being grounded and rooted in what was important in the Chinese aspect of learning. And so we pride ourselves as a bilingual school, and we have 3 keystones, which is why we're called Keystone Academy. So one is the bilingual education. The second one is in being rooted in the culture of China. And the third one is character development in a residential setting. So we are a boarding school. And one of the intentions of the founders was to bring back all the positive qualities of boarding that was existing in some of the New England schools or the American schools that had boarding, and bringing that in. And a large part of that was character development. And so all 3 of these are really key and crucial to our school. When I joined the school was in a mode ready to move technology and digital learning in a new direction. And we ended up changing and morphing the terminology to innovation and digital learning, mainly because when we're looking ahead to the future of where student learning is moving, not all of it has to do with technology, and even though it is a big part of it. And we wanted to make sure it encompassed that future-looking lens for our students. How do we prepare our students for their future and all that's coming up? And when we look at the World Economic Forum report, there's a lot in that encompasses other things such as critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, and all these things are still also included in things that we talked about in ISTE, in our ISTE certification course. There's design thinking, and there's a new thrust towards learning spaces and how that affects learning. And none of that actually has to do with technology, but more preparing our students so that they can think about the new challenges that they will be facing, problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning, all of those kind of things. So we thought that having the word innovation would encompass a lot more of that, and then still emphasizing the fact that a lot of it is digital. And so that's my role in our school.
Yeah, certainly, as we look towards the future, we've progressed past this idea of technology being there for technology's sake. And really, I think you're right that this the idea of innovation encompassing a lot more things like learning spaces and problem-based learning and inquiry-based learning and all these things is a really important stance to take to prepare students for the world ahead. And it sounds like, and what you described about Keystone Academy really is filling it's filling a gap in something that Chinese students might traditionally be offered in the public school system. And so, thank you and thank Keystone Academy for creating another avenue for Chinese students to both be in touch with their identity and their culture as being mainland Chinese, but also having the sort of opportunities for character building and in bilingual education. So thank you. So I want to talk to you. So schools are inherently about people, and people are, right, we're emotional beings. So I'm sure that the pandemic has been an emotional experience for everyone, and I'm sure that that you're no different. So maybe just can you share just a little bit about what this has been like for you being in Beijing, and maybe a little bit about how the school supported you through the emotional aspect of your work through this time.
Mm-hmm. I have a love-hate relationship with the pandemic, with COVID-19. Prior to the pandemic, we were embarking on change. So I was in my second year, and one of the big changes was moving from this ICT teacher approach where everything was siloed and technology was a course to an integration approach, and was met with some challenges, teachers not really understanding how to bring on a coach and what integration looked like. And then the pandemic hit, and so we, in the beginning of the fall, just as we were moving through that change management, it was quite a bit of a struggle. And when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden, everybody was on board with everything. So it pretty much, we went from, we don't really want to do it, to, yes, we're on board. What can we do? And all those barriers were lifted, and all the training we had before, where people were sort of half-hearted attending, now we offered training every day for our staff in the very beginning of the pandemic. And it was 1-hour sessions every morning at 9 a.m. And I would have anywhere from 100 to 150 faculty attendance in every single training. And this was optional. And teachers were completely on board, completely thankful, using it and utilizing it, and becoming very versed in all of the tools that we were sharing and how to implement it. And so this is where that love came from with COVID. I keep quoting Sugata Mitra. He had done a keynote session during the pandemic with Toggle Ties. And one of the things he said was that COVID-19 moved people along where his research in the past 20 years has not been able to move. And he was saying, I've been trying to convince people about play-based learning, personalized learning, letting students, that children can learn if they are given the tools and given the space and time. And nothing moved that. And now here we had this pandemic, and everything's personalized, everything's asynchronous, and students get to have their own space and time to learn as they wish. And that's kind of how I felt, like, in that I didn't have 20 years of research like he did, but in that short time frame of 4 or 5 months, which was super painful, and trying to move people along, we maybe chipped a little bit of the iceberg. But COVID came along, and all of a sudden everyone was fully on board. So that, in that sense, it was really, really gratifying and very, very positive in
Mhm.
terms of emotions. But then at the same time, it was very draining, very tiring. I don't think I've ever been so tired working before. And I like working. I'm
Mhm.
used to kind of working late and working on the weekends. But there were times where on the weekends I actually just said I can't work, and
Yeah.
that's different for me. I was just so mentally drained, so tired. The number of times where, I mean, we were in fight or flight mode the whole 6 months, like 5-6
Mhm.
months,
Mhm.
and that's not normal. Like you don't, you're not in that, your adrenaline rush all the time. And I think that's what was tiring everyone out, and myself for sure, is, I don't know what's going to happen. Yes, we're opening.
Mhm.
And then a week later, no, we're not opening. Or we open, and then 3 days before end of school, we closed again. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it was just constantly trying to manage stakeholder expectations,
Mhm.
parents, students, faculty. And we have faculty who were here and faculty who were outside of the country who all had different needs. We have bilingual, we have cultural sensitivities between faculty. We've already had that
Mhm.
challenge prior to the pandemic, but you've
Mhm.
got the Chinese staff work a certain way and the foreign staff work a certain way. And then you've got foreign staff who are in Asia Pacific, some who are in Europe, and some who are in the Americas, and they all had different needs. And so trying to manage all of those stakeholders and
Mhm.
make decisions that would be honoring all of their needs was very, very challenging. Um, but then at the
Yeah, I
same
mean,
time, oh, sorry. But then at the same time, our school leadership team met together 3 times a week and never felt so much like we were in a team. Um, we didn't always agree. We still don't always agree, but we definitely were on the same team, and that was really um, satisfying and yeah, and very, just, you feel very thankful for that.
yeah, it's sort of the idea that like being in the crucible, I mean, being forged in that fire together. Yeah, it is, very draining to to have to really transform our relationship and our stance to work, right? Most folks in education hadn't worked in this style before, and at the same time transforming our relationship with school, transforming our relationship with our coworkers, with our students, our families that we serve. Um, it's very draining. And then at the same time, there's so much promise in it. When I hear you say something like, that you were having 100 to 150 faculty volunteering to join and to jump on board new practices that initially they resisted. Kelly, speaking to Kelly Grogan the other day, who was at the Chinese International School in Hong Kong, and she used a phrase that I loved. She said she was talking about that because folks were untethered from their old practices, that they were eager to jump on board to new practices. That
Mm.
those old footholds were no longer there, and so it
Mm-hmm.
opened them up to the sort of change that great people like you and throughout innovative schools have been pushing for a long time. So I want to back up now because right you mentioned 3 days, you'd fast forwarded to the end of school, and then there was another disruption there in Beijing because of there's a small cluster of cases. But to back up, what was people were all spread out. What was your school's initial response to this pandemic? to get the learning going again.
Yeah, I've done a few interviews where I share this instant, and it's pretty much etched in my mind, where we were on Chinese New Year vacation break, and we were hearing about Wuhan, and we're like, oh, things are getting worse. And I was WeChatting with Clint Hamada at ISB, and we've been collaborating here and there prior to the pandemic, but since the pandemic, we've been between him and then Carrie Lee Beasley at WAB, we've just had this really intense relationship with each other, just sharing really openly. But Clint had wrote back to me, and I'm at this beach in Philippines, and he said, "Do you guys have an emergency response plan?" And I wrote back to him, "No, but that's a great idea." So literally and that was I think the Wednesday before school was, maybe the Monday before school was supposed to start. So we were partway through our Chinese New Year break. And so it was because of that, I was like, I'm going to just start writing my thoughts down in like a brief planning. And then sure enough, our head of school ends up calling me and says, we're going to have a meeting. And I'm like, okay, I need to flesh this out more. And sure enough, we ended up using that plan pretty much because we had nothing else. So I started fleshing out a plan to have training for the staff the Monday and the Tuesday, training for the staff on the Monday, training for the parents and the students the Tuesday, and then not to start school until the Wednesday, to give our teachers a buffer. So then communication ended up having to go out to parents to say, school's not starting off February 3rd as planned. We will be starting the 6th. And I was WeChatting Kelly, I remember, and I was like, what are you guys using in terms of communication platform? We had decided to, so I wanted to unify everything to be for primary Seesaw, and then for secondary using Teams. But it ended up being that primary ended up using Seesaw and secondary used whatever they were already using, because we were all already on a one-to-one. And then Kelly's like, we're starting with email. And I was like, okay, it's good to know that that's a possibility. And yeah, the plan was to start asynchronous, and weekly bulletins. What would the schedule be? So yeah, that's what we ended up doing. Daily and weekly bulletins of activities. The leadership team started rolling that out through their middle leadership team. So the grade level leaders, the department leaders, so we pretty much followed that plan and just said, we're all asynchronous. Look at a 3-part lesson that you can give to a kid that they can simply do from home. And then as we moved along, that morphed a little bit as well. And then we also started a training plan where the Monday we had a full-on training for the teachers. We did a primary one, a secondary one, and then a primary one in Chinese. And it was just focused on how do you do video recordings if you needed to, like how to use QuickTime to do a video recording, how to use Teams, because we knew that we would eventually need video conferencing, and then some Seesaw basics for the Chinese staff. I mean, we've been using Seesaw all along, but it's amazing how many people didn't know how to use Seesaw really. So teaching them how to use activities and teaching them how to just Seesaw basics again. And then with the secondary, just having them understand Teams a little bit more. But that kind of ended up elevating. So I ended up working with Clinton and Carrie Lee about kind of our training plan as well through that, because during COVID, a lot of people asked us, because they knew we were doing daily training, what was our thinking and planning behind our training. And it really came down to, in the very beginning, it was that Maslow before Bloom idea. What were their immediate needs? And in order to meet those immediate needs, they need to know the core systems. So our core systems was Teams and Seesaw, and then manage back video. How do you do video meetings? How do you record yourself on video? So those were kind of those core systems. Outlook we did as well. You know, how do you properly use Outlook? And so the beginning phases of our training were very focused on our core systems. I have a graphic that I can send to you. And then it moved on to teaching and learning tools. So once people felt comfortable in the core systems, okay, what addendum tools can you use? So Flipgrid, assessment tools, research tools, and all of those we started bringing in. And then we moved into, I mean, there's blurred lines in here, but everything kept deepening. So we still had core systems training, but we would bring in additional thinking about pedagogy now. Okay, so now we're in an online setting. How is online learning different from face-to-face learning? What are some things you need to think about? And how do you keep students engaged? How do you check in on them? How do you make it interactive and not just a talking head? What are some visible thinking routines that you can think about? How do you differentiate in an online setting? So we have a Center for Student Development who they work a lot with our special needs students, and they do a lot of training around all of that. So, and then we talked about the bilingual piece. What are some nuances about Chinese and English that you need to keep in touch with? So that's when the pedagogy came in. And then the fourth level started being social and emotional development and learning. So again, we worked very heavily with our counselors. They came in, talked about strategies for social emotional support, not only for the teachers, but also for the staff. I brought in guest speakers. So this is where like the global community was so, such a blessing. They are so open, so generous with their time. I had, for example, Sylvia Duckworth came and did a sketch note session for us. Holly Clark came and did a session on visible thinking, routines and assessments. We had 2 demo slams where people from around the world came and shared tools. We had Rushton Hurley come and do a session on just using images and how that can help. So yeah, it was and our leaders came in at different times. So it was like TV back in the day. At 9 a.m. everyone came and joined the daily training for the day. We had an ongoing Teams chat. People just joined that chat every day. Eventually we petered out to 3 times a week, and then 2 times a week, and then personalizing it by department. But for a good 2 months, it was every day to 3 times a week. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure, as that, as the uncertainty from being, this might just be temporary to it being going on, that, the approach, it sounds like, evolved as you started to meet the needs, the most basic needs for people being able just to connect and to communicate with each other. And then deepening, deepening the level of needs that your community had for, integrating additional tools, and then addressing online pedagogy, and then integrating social and emotional learning. The way you describe it now, it sounds very, it sounds very nice and neat and linear, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but I'm sure, you know, it was challenging at the same time, and there was learning that was going along. So it sounds like that the school evolved, it reorganized the way that it did some of the learning, or the way that you were doing learning, both for faculty, but also for students. Do you want to talk a little bit about that you want to talk a little bit about?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just remember there's an element that was really crucial in terms of our response that I didn't mention, and that was at the leadership level. So partway through Chinese, like before the Chinese New Year break was over, our head of school made it a point to tell all the leadership team as well as the school that he was flying back to China. I think that was actually very pivotal because of that. All of the other leaders who were also at different parts of the world said, "Oh, we've got to get back." And I mean, even in my mind, when we were in Philippines, we were like, "Oh, should we stay here? Is it safe, or should we go back?" And then finally, we go, "Well, Malcolm's going back, and I don't want to be stuck here in a hotel for all this time with I don't know what kind of internet. Let's just we need to go back." So I think the response that our leadership took was we all went back, and pretty much all our leaders went back. We had a few who were still stuck outside, but that made a huge difference because from there, we physically met 3 times a week. And there were our head of school had split it up into 2 response teams. One was an operations team and one was an academic team. And they met separately. And then we also had a 3rd team, which was a residential team because we had residential faculty living on campus. But the academic team focused on the teaching and learning side, and the operations team focused on the health and safety and the operations of the building. And that was huge, I think, in terms of our planning. We had just hired an on-site doctor and we were like, wow, that was an amazing foresight. But he was pivotal in making sure that all the paperwork was ready, and questionnaires were sent to staff. We had our COO had flown back right away from his trip in Japan, making sure that the security and our facilities were briefed in terms of what to do. So throughout the pandemic, these 2 teams continued to operate, and at different levels had different work that needed to be done. So when we had reopening again, and in end of May, our operations team had a huge part in making sure everything was ready and up to government regulation and standards. And we had government relations team who was constantly meeting with the government. And I mean, you would know this, but the way that a lot of these meetings work was you get a phone call and it would be, we have a meeting in an hour, and they would be gone. And so, I think that was also really helpful in terms of a response to the pandemic. It was very challenging, but being able to meet with the leadership team and laugh and cry in the same room about situations, and know that we had each other's back, and we could talk about it, and we were in the same time zone, I think was really, really helpful.
Yeah, so it sounds like, for the school to be able to pivot and really change how it did just about everything, that didn't just happen out of the blue. There were some underlying capacities, dispositions, mindsets, in the school that allowed it to have success, to make all of these changes. So can you talk a little bit about what are some of the I guess, some more of the hardware aspects, not just in a tech sense, the hardware of the school, the capacity of the human capital, physical capital, all these things, but also the software, right? The mindsets, the disposition that the people at your school had that allowed this pivot to go on with such great success.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, like, I came into the school and we already had really strong functioning operations team. I mean, we're still a pretty young school and there's a lot of kinks to work out obviously still, but these were people who had been in previous roles at other schools and knew what they were doing and had experience to draw from. And so things such as, you know, we had to move tables immediately, like that wasn't an issue. Or we had like a nurse staff that was already available, and that the doctor joining made this team even stronger now, because it was actually a team of medical staff that was on campus who could guide us and give us information. We had people who already knew and understood Chinese government and the way that the government works. So that relationship piece was very helpful. And so we would, in leadership meetings, constantly look to our leaders who were our local leaders and say, well, what do you think that actually means? And what do you think we should decide on? And that helped us in guiding our decisions. And our head of school is a very experienced head of school, Malcolm McKenzie. And I mean, I've been feeling very blessed to be able to work with him. And he's worked in multiple settings around the world, Botswana and US, UK. And he said this was one of what I loved about his leadership was throughout this whole pandemic, it wasn't like, okay, I know what to do. Or he was like a stoic or anything. He's like, I've never been in this situation in all my years of leadership. And this is new to me. I really don't know what to do. And he shared with us at our leadership, our end of year leadership meeting, because he had just read Nuance, which was a Michael Fullan book on leadership. And one of the phrases he took from that book was, go into a meeting not with a solution, but end the meeting with a solution. And that truly was what happened. He would come into the meeting with an idea. I think we should start school here, or I think we should do this. And then we would all like think about it. And then one brave soul would say, I don't agree. And then another person, I don't agree. And then at the end of it, he would be, okay, so let's come back at a next meeting and talk about it. And he took his time in making the final decision. And sometimes it was democratic and sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes he just made the decision on our behalf. And none of us ever felt like we didn't have a voice. It was, you know, the decision had to be made for whatever reason. And we had our say in it. And there are sometimes just a lot of other underlying things that would sway the decision a certain way, whether it be we wanted to make sure the parents were satisfied so that we don't lose our clientele and go under as a school, or, well, we have to make this decision because the government says we have to, or we have to make this decision because otherwise our faculty is going to burn out. And so I think our head of school, Malcolm, was a really pivotal piece in all of that in terms of the running of the school. He allowed all the other leaders to speak up. We have always had a structure in terms of leadership where we had an academic team and a business team to begin with. So the structure of the meetings weren't foreign to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was underlying in terms of our
Yeah.
what did you call it? The workings or mechanics of the school.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing that our school had was we have a director of technology, and then I'm the director of innovation and digital learning. So my role is still pretty new, and I think me and I think throughout this pandemic had a clearer sense of what our roles were. There were a few times where, and we were, I mean, I love working, I don't, but, and I think conflict has been positive, but there were a couple of times where there was conflict because he would say, you're doing our job. And I'm like, but they're asking us. He's like, I know, but you need to divert it to us. And I'm like, okay. So, I mean, and that's been a problem where, ed tech coaches often do troubleshooting. And I think it was helpful that we had these kind of conflicts, working things out with each other where, okay, I would tell my coaches, if it's an IT issue, just divert it to IT. And it ended up, like, we ended up working a much better rhythm. I think where we were at the end of the year was a very more clear job scope of who we were. We do training, they do support, network. They knew kind of all the updates about Microsoft, so then I would just lean in on them, and yeah, it worked out much better as we kind of worked through those things, and the conflict was very positive in terms of moving things forward as opposed to being a grudge. And I think that was very healthy to know that we could have conflict and still be a team. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you. Appreciate you shouting out your operations team. That's something that it's for people that aren't insiders in schools. Those are only the sorts of things that, unfortunately, you seem to notice the ops teams when things don't get done, right? And so I really appreciate you, sharing that having that strong, experienced team to be able to manage everything from the medical aspects of school to moving furniture to handling government relations. Those are all such important things to make the product, right, if you will, right, the teacher in the classroom, to allow those things to run smoothly. And the other thing too is that I love you mentioning the type of leadership that's going on behind closed doors, where the head of school really is distributing some of his leadership and not coming in with a solution, but rather trying to walk out with one. And that's what good leaders do, right? They hire not people who all agree with them, right? They hire people who are, they create the space and hire people, right, who might be able to say, I don't see it that way. And to also draw on those, you mentioned, sometimes having a diverse staff or leadership team can be a challenge, right? Where people have different experiences and backgrounds and opinions. Instead, right, you were able to harness that as a strength and and when it was appropriate, leaning on their expertise as, well, what is this government, what is this new, I don't know, this new guidance from the government really mean, right? And what do we really have to do, and how is that going to look for our school while we maintain our strong government relations? These are all the sorts of things that most people don't get to see in schools, and so I really appreciate you giving a nod to all of them as things, as parts of your school, parts of Keystone Academy that allowed it to have such great success, always behind the scene things. I'm curious through all of this, because there are so many other aspects of school that go unseen to a parent or to a student, and one of those things I think is the broader purpose that school has for people's lives, right? Beyond learning their maths and literacy and STEM, right, tech skills, whatever. How has this changed what you think Keystone's purpose is for its school community, or has it maybe shined a brighter spotlight on some aspects that weren't visible or apparent before?
Yeah, I think, and with regards to parents, I think our school did a pretty good balance in terms of making sure we had their feedback and taking it into account as we move forward with the distance learning. We had our head of school had weekly meetings with the PTA chair, and even prior to making communications to the parents, would say, here's what we're planning. What reaction do you think the parents would have? And he would really take the advice of the PTA chair quite seriously. At one point, there was a worry about tuition. Well, I mean, that continues to be a worry, but by many schools. But a lot of parents assembled together in other schools and rallied to petition for tuition refunds. And even on the government level, that was not favorable, because it would cause a domino effect throughout. And so I think that balance in being able to meet the parent needs, but at the same time still hold integrity in terms of what we felt was important in terms of education, was a challenge. And of course, listening to the teachers and the feedback from the students. So we did several surveys throughout the pandemic to parents, teachers, and students in different formats about their learning, and used it to pivot at various points. The number of times we've had a plan, scrapped it, and then redone it. One thing I had shared with people is I felt like this was design thinking completely throughout this whole pandemic. Was, here's our minimal viable product, let's put it out there. And then we'd get feedback, and then we'd iterate, and we'd iterate again. And so the number of times we've iterated our programming has been amazing to show our resilience, our flexibility, I think, as a whole school. Because every time we pivoted, the students had to pivot, the teachers had to pivot, the parents had to pivot. So, I mean, everybody was being very flexible in that regards. Things such as workload, parents in the very beginning, and these are Chinese parents saying there's too much work. and we're like, oh, okay. So we would have to tell teachers, you're giving too much work. And it was hard for the teachers to give less work because they were worried about student learning and whether or not they would be able to learn all that they needed for the year. And putting priority on social emotional support. So teachers carving like advisory and homeroom taking a huge precedence. There was one point where the leaders had put together a video, and the student had said in the video, I miss school a lot. I miss my teachers. I miss my friends. I even miss fighting with my friends, and was really helped, I think, everybody to see how important of a social emotional piece that school plays. Not only that, during pandemic, everybody was much more isolated, and not all the students have siblings, and they're stuck with their family, and family starts learning a lot about their own family dynamic. And I think in some families, in homes, it was very positive, but in some homes it was even more challenging than before. We're a boarding school. We had international boarders who ended up staying here, and that caretaking piece as a school was also brought to light, and I think that was really neat how the school came together. When there were students who had to quarantine ahead of time for 14 days, we had like a baking roster where every day somebody would bake something and bring their treat to the people who were in quarantine. Students self-gathered and continued to do self-service learning because they felt that they needed to do something. And so they gathered together supplies for Wuhan. They did tutoring for people who are in Wuhan, and we would highlight a lot of those stories. They self-gathered and created a music concert. The student council continued forward and created a Teams group just for social emotional support for students. When boarding started again, when we opened up, the kids were so good when they first came back. It was like, I'm so happy to be back. They were on their best behavior. But as time moved on, and we actually didn't have our full boarding staff, it became really apparent how important that stability was as well. And when we were told 3 days before school we had to let the students go home, it was really devastating for the kids that they had to leave beforehand and they couldn't do their proper goodbyes because it was really sudden when that blip came back up in Beijing. So just that.
Yeah, almost like you thought you'd come back and you were going to get to celebrate the end of the school year together, and then even that kind of being robbed from you, from the students, from the whole school community, must have been just really, really difficult ending to a difficult year. At the same time, what you're describing, you're describing all the self-gathering and self-organizing of students to continue service learning and to do things for the boarders and to attend to the social and emotional needs. Also, is inspiring and speaks to just how powerful a resilient school community can be in shaping the lives of young people and the lives that those young people touch. And so even through this, there's there's some other, I'm sure those are all things that we want to stick, all of those, right? All of those meaningful, life life experiences that get to the core of our humanity, I guess. What are some of the other creative practices? What are some creative practices, that some additional things that you saw throughout this, both online and in the transition back to campus, that you're proud of, that you want to share with others, and that you hope might stick as we go, back to school in the fall?
Yeah, I think our Dean of Faculty did a really good job in really keeping a pulse of where faculty was feeling. And so, for example, we had a new batch of staff joining in August, and there's a lot of trepidation about whether or not they would still have their job, whether they would, how do we prepare them? And right from the get-go, there was emails sent back. They were buddied up with a staff member. We had an online orientation course that was created for them. So usually we have like a 2-week orientation for our new faculty, but we ended up creating an online version of the orientation. So things such as, what are our mission, what are, how do you define, like, how do you make like what does transition look like? What does security look like? What does child protection look like? Things like that normally we do a session with them about. We just condensed it into a 10-minute video, and then they did visible thinking routines around them. We created a whole teams. It was like it was pretty much an online course. And we would have weekly meetings so that they get to meet each other already from the beginning, and they felt already part of the community. And I think that was really important because in other schools, you saw some staff members saying, we're not going to come back, we're not going to join the school, and maybe breaking contract. Whereas right from the beginning, all of the new staff felt very welcomed and supported and glad to be joining our community. So I think that was very innovative in terms of how we pivoted that. We continued with our head of school meetings and assemblies throughout the whole pandemic, and I think that was really important in keeping that communal feeling. So student council was still involved in a lot of them. We have a house system, and we'd have house points. And so the student council would announce house points during these meetings. There would be information that was sent out that was important for students. So it felt like, the rhythm of the school was still going, and I think that was important. I think the way that primary school reopened was really innovative as well. They, right from the get-go, had a reopening team that was a mixture of administrators and teachers and support staff. And the primary had a little bit more time than the secondary, so they tested out different social distancing strategies. We had this hula hoop penny, and one of the teachers wore it around for a week just to see what it would feel like for a student. We redid what recess would look like. So rather than free for all, they had stations, and it was really interesting because when the students came back, a lot of the students said, I like this method of recess more. There was less bullying. I enjoyed the activities. And so things such as that, you're like, oh, well, never would have thought of that. Like, yeah, sometimes kids come out and during recess and they feel lonely, but during that time they never felt lonely because there's always an activity. They knew where they were going. It was still fun. It was still active.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
I
it's
think
that,
those are
yeah,
things.
design thinking. You mentioned it, this design thinking the whole time. I would love to see. That's a great user case with the hula hoop pen, or the
Yeah.
teacher wearing that to see what it would be like. And yeah, and maybe that's maybe that's one of the things, or maybe it's not specific practices, but maybe it's the stance towards constantly testing and refining ideas in schools, and through getting feedback, testing, refining all of these things, to then come up with something better, right, in the next iteration. And maybe that's the thing that we can that schools can learn from your experience at Keystone Academy, and that we can all carry forward, into the fall, well, and beyond, to continue to engage in that cycle of continuous improvement, with better and better iterations of how we do school. Well, Sandra, I want to thank you so much for your time talking. The world has a lot to learn from your experience, from you and your experience at Keystone Academy. Thanks again for joining.
Thanks. It was great kind of
Yeah.
having some reflection time too.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So.